My ex-girlfriend tried to eat me. This happened to me and my girlfriend, Julia. We'd been together for 3 years. We'd always been inseparable and obsessive over one another, indulging in each other's company and never wanting to be apart. I had by this point picked up on a few of Julia's more extreme quirks, but I had always been able to look past her addictive personality and strange episodes. She was my girlfriend, and I loved her. And when you love someone, even their unsavory traits become attributes that you look at with a strange fondness. Not for the negative signs themselves, but for the whole person they make. Without Julia's temper, or her opinionated nature, or her overly clingy and touchy habits, she wouldn't be Julia. And I loved Julia. But it was towards the end of that 3-year period that I started to feel differently about the woman who I thought I'd spend most of my life with. I started to notice how much more her strange actions had started to irritate me, latching onto my arm and refusing to give for almost anything in public spaces, or constantly answering for me, or telling me off whenever I said something she didn't like. Her positive features, as well, had also started to grate on me. She made this cute whistling noise while she slept, and had a unique way of buttering her bread in a precise square pattern. Things I had once thought endearing now only reminded me of how I couldn't see her in the same way I once did. But more than that, there were some things she did that I had no explanation for and couldn't rationalize on any level. Things that set me on edge and made me feel uneasy around the woman I loved, even if I wasn't any better for strange interests. You see, Julia and I had met online through mutual friends in the BDSM community. I know how that sounds, and trust me, on reflection, it probably wasn't the best place for either of us to try founding a happy and healthy relationship. But that was more due to us instead of the practice. If anything, it helped build so much trust between us, and was half the reason our relationship had been as healthy as it was. It was always somewhat expected that we'd both be a little on the stranger side. But her mannerisms I'm referring to involved things both in and out of the bedroom, and things that I'd never seen anyone else do online or in person. Firstly, she had a number of weird habits beneath the sheets that I don't want to get into. It's not my place to share it here, but one thing I can say was a peculiar ritual she performed both before and after any acts. She would bind me down and then trace the edges of her teeth along parts of my exposed skin, the underside of my calf, along each finger, across my biceps, and more. Then out of the bedroom, she has this strange aversion to meat, and I don't mean she's vegan or obsessed with her dietary intake. I mean she almost exclusively eats raw red meats. There are few experiences I've had that can compare to going out to dinner with her and friends at a steakhouse and watching the dainty woman I love tear into a pound of bloody muscle. Coupling these together, I often found her caressing food that she was particularly fond of with her teeth, in the same way she did to me. Every time I asked her about it, she simply brushed me off, comparing it to a love of food with the cute phrase, "It's just a thing I do, Liam, like fiddling with hair." But even her sickly sweet words couldn't prevent my suspicions from rising. I was falling out of love, and it hurt, but it hurt worse because of how she never seemed to notice. Every morning, she'd greet me with the same polite smile, her chestnut brown hair falling over her cheeks in soft curls. "Morning, meal." That was her nickname for me. It's Spanish for honey. Something that used to hit me like a warm hug, that wrapped around my whole body as it lifted me into the day, now stuck to my skin with the same sick sweetness as the food she so lovingly referred to me as. I had been building up courage to tell her how I felt, being nicer to her than usual, buying nice gifts, jewels, dresses, vinyl records, and Criterion films that she was interested in. I knew that it would be tough to break away from her, but I didn't want to sever ties. I only wanted to be friends, and I thought that we could still hang out and bond together. After many weeks of spoiling Julia with gifts and praise, I made my move on a cold Saturday night. I had taken her out to a quiet walk along the riverside, watching a small group of swans that drifted past us on our stroll. She wasn't gripping to me quite as tight as she normally did on that walk. Instead, infatuated with the pattern of 2 swimming swans, the birds hung close to each other, unlike most of the other swans, standing apart so obviously from the solitary birds, one black and one white. The contrast was jarring, how one swan was so different from the dark around it, and the other was nigh invisible. I elected to sit the pair of us down on a bench only a few paces away from the birds before I turned to face her. She was smiling at me, and even in the dead of night, with the moon shimmering down as our sole source of light, she still seemed to radiate a bright warmth that was almost too much to stare at directly. Yet I persevered, knowing what I needed to do. "Julia," I started carefully, my throat going dry. "I brought you out here because I needed to talk to you about something serious." She nodded frantically in reply, her smile slinking even wider along her face as her eyes winced with anticipation. Hanging on to my every word. "We've been together for what, 3 years now?" 3 years, 2 weeks. She bowed her head for me to continue, shaking one of her hands as she did so. "Right." My voice was on a slight edge that I hoped wasn't so noticeable as to deter her enthusiasm. I wanted to try and use her high spirits to soften the blow I was about to deal. "That's a long time, and I was thinking that maybe, yes?" She urged me onwards with a rising chime of excitement to her voice that tugged at my heartstrings and threw my mind into turmoil as I gave her the news I had meant to deliver. "I think we should split up." Her smile faltered with the corners of her mouth twitching uncomfortably as she shook her head and leaned closer to me on the bench, practically pushing me back against the cold, wet wood that stabbed through my jacket. "What?" Her lips trembling meekly as her hands tightened into uncomfortable bunches that pressed into my chest. I lowered my palms and slowly enclosed her taut fists, trying to warm that icy tinge that the cold air had impressed onto her skin. It took me a while to explain everything to her, explaining how I had started to see her differently and how I didn't feel that it was my place to keep a relationship like this going. She protested, continuously, almost not comprehending what I was telling her and rebutting my points with painful memories that she tried to serve to me as proof of our love. From the time when I still reciprocated that love, all that did was make this exchange more agonizing. I was struggling to get through to her, and in the end, it was one little sentence from Julia that broke me. "I hadn't met anyone like you." Her words trailed off as she turned her gaze downward, considering what to say next with quiet contemplation. I could see that a storm of uncertainty and confusion had slammed through her thoughts. I couldn't tell what she was thinking, but her next words made it almost clear. The way the moon would be if obscured by a slight fog. "I thought you cared about me. We'd planned everything together." Tears started to well up in the corners of her eyes as she shook her head. She was doing everything she could to prevent herself from crying. "I know, but I don't see you like that anymore, Julia. I still care so much about you and I don't want to hurt you. That's why I need to tell you this." Her head had been shaking back and forth in an automated swinging that synchronized with every word. But, her words were tumbling as she lowered her gaze, her hair falling over her forehead as I could see tears beginning to stream down the sides of her soft cheeks. I thought you would give me a ring?" I could feel every word she spoke yanking at my heartstrings. I'd lead her on. The gifts, the praises, the meeting at night. I'd been such a moron that I couldn't see how someone like Julia would take it. She was a romantic. Her mind wouldn't have even registered the notion of my distance. Immediately, I pulled her into a hug, wrapping my arms around her and gently rocking back and forth as her body was racked with the throbbing shakes of silent, soft cries. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She was tiny in my arms. We were the same height, but I was so much broader as I squeezed her with a gentle and loving embrace, wanting to imbue the gesture with all the emotion I could muster. The hug lasted for longer than I expected, minutes ticking by until I started to pull away, only noticing how my arms seemed to refuse to come undone. A stabbing sharpness in my chest brewed concern in my stomach, a growing flame of worry that was stoked as the acute razor grew in intensity. I pulled away once more, wrenching my arms away from Julia and looking down at my jacket, below my clavicle where the pain grew. Her hands, previously bunched, were now unwound in a pair of twisted, bony implements that dug deep into the cloth, nails digging themselves into place and refusing to dislodge. "Julia, that hurts," I mumbled, lowering my hands to try and remove her hands. My hands touched her wrists, and I suddenly felt hot as I was thrown back against the bench, my back slamming into cold wood as water smeared my jacket. "You don't get to leave!" Her scream came in a bellowing growl that echoed all the way from within her guts, vomiting the words into my eyes as her legs came up, pinning me down as her nails burrowed ever deeper. I felt small with her above me, eyes wild, shining behind her threads of loose hair that obscured her face in shadow, save for her lips that dripped with spit and revealed twisting and grinding teeth. I had shrunk as her back arched with primal fury. Never before had I seen her like this. We'd had fights and arguments before, and I wasn't above letting her overpower me. But this was different. Something that came from the very deepest and most personal part of her person. A place that sucked the color from my face and kept me from crying out, drawing everything into her in a way that demanded I listen to her. It was magnetic and horrifying, seeing someone I loved so much snap in a way that I could never imagine any person ever doing. Then, as quickly as it came, her wrath dissipated. Her face returned to normal as she pulled away, seemingly releasing how she had acted as she now stood back off the bench. The shadow of herself that had grown over me now retreated back inside of her, folding away from my frightened eyes as if nothing had even happened. I sat watching her in silence for a time before she whispered. Her voice almost vanished into the air around my head, nature itself speaking to me in place of Julia. "I'll make sure you love me, like the old days." Immediately after she had spoken, she turned on her heel and vanished into the dark night around us, her back fading before I had properly registered what had been said, leaving me alone on that cold, wet bench, eyes vaguely tracing the outline of that lone white swan, struggling to determine if there had ever really been two swans at all. Hours later, I was laying on my bed in a cold sweat with one hand holding my phone up to my face and the other vanishing beneath the sheets, watching the content scroll past my half-closed eyes as the beating rhythm of my heart slowly picked up. The room was muggy and humid, saturated by a sticky feeling that stuck to my skin and sunk its way into every pore. The images on the screen continued to burn their way into my mind. Supple skin, shining leather, and the sheen of blood drawn that was accompanied by the deafening crack of a whip. The tension inside my chest rose with every flickering image, before it peaked and I collapsed, my body intertwining with the sheets in a loveless embrace. Now was when the shame started to sink in. That lonely feeling of disgust and self-loathing that always seemed to catch itself in my mind. I hadn't felt it in so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to lay in my own sweat, with horse blinders focusing my vision on the disgusting images that lay before me. I guess I had Julia to thank for that. I regretted leaving her, missing her in that moment, where I spent however long staring up at the ceiling for an indiscernible amount of time. The only noises being the banging of neighbors and general clatter of the city's thrumming life. It took too long to shake myself out of that stupor. No regrets. I couldn't regret this. Breaking up with Julia was the right thing to do. Our relationship had devolved so much. It was loving but fake, and Frankenstein together with a thick red thread that was wound so tight around my wrists I thought I might snap. I couldn't keep pushing her, even if we both shared mutual interests. I shifted uncomfortably where I lay before standing up and beginning to clean up after myself, stripping the sheets with lumbering, tired movements of a man who needed rest but had to deny it from himself. With the completion of that laborious task, I took a short walk to my bathroom and started to scrub my skin with the brush that I used. The cool water soothing my already reddening skin, the brushing was beginning to cause. My goal was to wash out the humid slather that even in the pattering embrace of the cold shower refused to disappear. My scrubbing slowly grew more rigorous as both the events of my night and old memories congealed together, brewing in a soup that I choked on. Pictures of tongues, blood, hands, and joints, moving together in unison as the flashing lights burned through our flesh and the glowing silhouette of our physical beings, casting us prostrated before the empty eyes of soulless onlookers. All the while, I watched my tainted form from the ceiling, everything that made me whole, separated, and ethereal as a watcher to my own sick and crude pleasures. The sudden scraping of the brush, drawing blood, roused me, and the memories faded as they had arrived. A hiss escaped my lips as I turned to examine the wound. The soft pink color of exposed flesh was already releasing blood that shifted from that warm, wet life to a diluted, washed-out pink. It would heal quickly. Without too much more effort, I got dressed and wandered back into the empty mattress in my bedroom and started to assemble the sheets and blankets I felt appropriate for the night's temperature. I was in the process of wrestling the corner of the fitted sheet onto the bed when I noticed something perched on my cluttered bedside table that caught me off guard. A tingling sensation zipped down my back, cascading in waves that set my hairs on edge and left my muscles tense. Nestled in a messy but clear crescent pattern on my bedside table were a collection of photographs. Polaroid pictures that seemingly captured a frame within a smaller frame. Photos of me peering in through the various windows of my first-floor apartment, all encircling a slice of cured ham that was slathered in honey. In the moment, I didn't react at all. I just stared at the odd totem with a growing level of unease and confusion, imagining in my mind's eye someone stalking through my house, a slithering shadow that washed over my furniture and cupboards with a silent grace that didn't disturb anything, and leaving nothing to allude to their presence. Nothing except what they wanted to be found. Then a new slew of ideas hit me, and I slowly paced through my home back to the bathroom. Had I left the door ajar? At an angle that wouldn't have gone noticed when I pulled the door open, despite having closed it the full way to shower? The cold breeze wound around my neck with tension tight enough I thought I was going to suffocate. Frozen in time, standing in a place that I had stood many times before, but now I was considering that someone had come through there while I had been totally unaware. I could almost see through the eyes of that ghost creeping around corners in the dark of my house, staring at my back through near-clear glass as it waited for me to find its shrine. A shrill beep pierced through the quiet night, and I jumped at the noise, revolving to face the source of the disturbance. My pulse steadied once I saw a sliver of blue light slicing its way in a near imperceptible line along the floor from my fridge, the door ever so slightly open. Off all the things that could have frightened me, this felt so mundane that I almost laughed. But the air was still thick with a strange silence that defied any natural quiet of an empty house, and I was hanging by a thread that was on the verge of snapping. Peering around the slide of the fridge and gently pulling it open, waiting with bated breath for what I expected to be a horrifying sight. What I found instead was so much worse. A platter that stood apart from the plastic Tupperwares and was lavishly adorned with thick slices of watermelon. It was a salad, of my favorite kind, arranged in the way a florist might adorn a bouquet of blooming roses. This crown of ripe red fruit that glistened with the sheen of raw beef, like the honey-glazed him from earlier, propped up a single centerpiece that shone with pride. A warm photograph of Julia and I, cuddling together in bed, a heart in red circling the pair of us, and our eyes were scribbled over with the same love-struck motif. Seeing that sight made me feel sick to my stomach as I shook my head, reading the words underlining the photo in my head. Although my inner monologue changed and shifted, becoming less my own voice, and instead the sweetened song of my estranged lover. Eat well, meal. XXX. Julia. To say that I was disturbed by my find last night would be an understatement. I dialed for the police the second I had found the salad in my fridge and waited with a knife for them to arrive at my doorstep, constantly checking over my shoulder out of fear that Julia would be standing right there, smiling as gay as beaming sunlight without a hint of malice on her face. I couldn't tell if it was weird that I was more frightened of Julia simply being normal, unbothered by the events of the previous day, even offering some of my favorite foods in the fridge ready to eat, an odd contrast to the sick token that marked her stay in my home. I now stood on the threshold of my home, answering questions as one of the two officers searched through the house, inspecting cupboards, shelves, and objects with careful wariness. All the while, his partner bombarded me with questions regarding my ex. Has this happened before? No. Was anything stolen? No. With my whirlpool of muddled thoughts still fizzing from the night's events, I barely noticed as the second officer walked up behind us, rejoining his companion by the car, bearing a mute expression on his lips and exchanging a silent stare with his partner. A quick glance that was soon reorientated in my direction. What did you say the suspect's name was again? He asked with almost pained indifference on his tongue. Julia Lilitou. As he prattled off more questions, the cop beside him fumbled for a notepad, jotting things down with quick, decisive scribbles. Of the two officers, the one currently asking the questions was more well put together, with a narrow, angular face, sporting a pair of burning eyes that carved through me with careful precision. His friend was less managed, pudgier, with a large horsebrush mustache and a sparkling pair of circular glasses perched atop his plump nose. I didn't take in his full form. The wiry man that stood at his side was already trying to wring as much information out of me as he could, clearly wanting to return without any further effort. "And she's your girlfriend?" The way he said that question indicated that he already had a second one primed and ready. "Was," I corrected swiftly, frustration rising in my throat. "Of 3 years?" "Yes," I retorted without pause, almost snapping at him, which I quickly realized was a mistake. Watching him lower his eyes and stare at me with pursed lips, casting his sideways gaze at my front door that still stood slightly ajar. Awful long time to spend with someone without sharing a place. There was a note of allegation to his words that stung on the cold winter air like a dull blade. I felt a sudden flush of crimson shame burning through my neck and shoulders, blooming in waves across my face. The answer they were after was one that I wasn't too keen on divulging. We were discussing moving in." His eyebrows arched in a half measure between confusion and surprise. "Discussing?" he asked with a bemused twinge in his lungs, beckoning me to continue. "Before we broke up," I nodded, trying to affirm my own admission of events. The sometimes days-long conversations that Julia would prompt me forward in, urging and prying responses from me as if they were treasured jewels, all whenever I was doing washing, cooking, or working. The conversations had often fallen into the pit of being one-sided, with Julia taking it upon herself to speak ideas aloud. The police exchanged a final glance and nodded before the wiry man with the thin face turned his attention back to me. "All right, the photos and salad are the only physical evidence we could find, and we'll need time to check for any DNA evidence." He looked behind me, eyes watching the door with such intensity that I thought that someone may have been there. Vague, foggy pictures of Julia's silhouette hovering at the threshold, grinning down at my back as she stared at me behind dark lashes. The notion stabbed at my back with a ghostly grace. The officer had continued talking to me as my mind wandered ever further into the tightening memories and daydreams that stuck in my peripheral ever since the night prior. The only things that I had been able to retain were that he suggested I stay at a friend's place and get my locks changed, both ideas that I dutifully decided to follow, or as dutifully as I was able. Contacting a good locksmith wouldn't be too much hassle. It was finding a place I could stay until Julia lost interest that was the hard part. How was I supposed to know what she would decide to do next? She had always been off-putting and unusual, but before last night, I would never have imagined her to break into my home. Plus, I didn't want to even consider roping any of our friends into this. I thought that I'd known her, but now I couldn't take the risk that she may escalate whatever endeavor she had planned. It would be too much if someone I cared about got hurt because of my own stupidity. With one final bow of thanks towards the officer, I re-entered my abode. The thick air within my now disturbed home crawled across my tongue with every breath. A sick, rising sensation started to grow within my stomach, and I had to steady my breathing, long and deep, to prevent myself from vomiting. I felt as though I was walking along the ceiling, and all the liquids inside me were being sucked out to the earth. It was wholly unpleasant, and I couldn't stand the sensation for long. I quickly collected my coat, keys, a change of clothes, and some other various knickknacks I felt appropriate before escaping out the front door. Stopping by the door of my car, I stumbled and dropped my keys, clattering against the pavement. I sighed briefly and started to kneel down to collect them, fallen leaves crunching against my weight. However, as I touched the ice-cold metal, a single flicker of faint motion caused me to tense up. An almost silent shuffling against the cement ground and a tiny discoloration that was a long, thin strand of black hair. The single piece of string shifted before pulling itself back behind the wheels. I was completely overcome with terror, my mind already racing to a single horrifying conclusion. It was her. She was under the car and she'd been watching me the whole time. I took a step back and nearly slid into the pavement, catching both my fall and scream. Crouching on the ground, I felt a new emotion overcome me, a boiling heat that bloomed across my cheeks and forehead, a grinding of teeth against tooth, twitching in my upper lip and a furrowed brow. I was being stupid. If she was here, then I could certainly overpower her, snap some sense into her, or at least scare her so she'd leave me alone. It was a brave thought that poured temporary confidence into my boots. Confidence that all but dissipated as I kneeled down to peer beneath the car and was left to gaze at the sight that beheld me. Nothing. No one had been there. Surely I hadn't been seeing things. A flickering line that precise wasn't something I would mistake. I knew the difference between hair and whatever I had seen. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to calm my nerves. If I was this on edge, then I wouldn't be able to figure all this shit out without panicking and doing something stupid. Brushing my brief lack of lucidity out of my mind, I clambered into my car with all the grace of a drunken gorilla and started to drive off down the street, casting long glances over my shoulder, into the back seat, and to the chair beside me. At any point, expecting Julia to simply exist where she had always sat, smiling at me with malignant ecstasy that made my back ache with a throbbing need, all while my heart was tightly wound to a near-lethal pressure. Yeah, sure, Liam. Make sure to say hi to your ma for us. That was Will. I had needed to clock off work and cash out my leave for the next 2 weeks so that I could drop off the radar for a bit until things with Julia cooled down. Will was a good man. He was my boss, but he acted more like a close uncle than a superior at the electronics store where I worked. It was an odd relationship we shared, given our close age, but the strange elder role he took up in my life. Thanks, Will. I knew you'd get this. Sorry, I have to head out for a bit. A snort on the other end of the phone call brought a smile to my face as I rounded the corner of the next turn, letting the man with the thick accent keep talking. There was something about his inflection that set my mind at ease. Nah, don't worry about it. You've put in a lot of good work for us. You deserve a break. He was a bad liar. I could have put more work in, but I could make it up to him once Julia was firmly out of the realm of threat. He didn't need to worry about that either. I could take care of myself. Oh, by the way, how's things with that Latin girl you were dating? The car hissed to a halt as I kicked the brakes with such ferocity my car bucked from the momentum. I felt that my body had been doused with chilled water and then was forced to sit in the cold pool that washed across the leather of my seat. But even in that cold thrash of reality and the screeching groan of skidding rubber, my boss had continued. His next words made my pupils shrink inside my widening golf ball eyes. I wasn't sure given that she came round earlier. My fingers slinked further around the steering wheel, the skin pressing against my bones and forcing the blood out of my fingers. I couldn't fathom Julia talking to Will. They'd never spoken much, but were always polite to each other and were still capable of making small talk. But the woman who'd broken into my home talking to my boss without my knowledge was deeply disturbing. What did she say to you? I inquired, trying to keep a casual demeanor as I started pushing my car further into the highway. A pause before he continued. Not much, to be honest. She asked about you mostly, said something about planning something special for the pair of you later this week. My heart started to sink with every passing word. She seemed pretty ecstatic about whatever it was. I'll tell you what, though, you're a lucky man. I'd kill to have a woman like that. I nearly rear-ended the guy in front of me as his words left a stinging pain behind my eyes. My face contorted as I bit my tongue and held myself back from sharing what had happened. I knew I could deal with this problem without his input. Thanks, I murmured back half-heartedly. This was bad. Something special later in the week? What could she possibly have been talking about? A saturating sense of dread crept along my back as I continued to push forward in the car, giving one final cough of thanks to Will before hanging up. I needed to focus on the drive and getting out of this city for a bit. I didn't want a chance bumping into Julia. Unfortunately, my plans of an expeditious retreat were wounded thanks to the roadworks and a glut of traffic that clogged the veins of this city, poisoning it with a strange slowness that was grating the pores on my skin with a slow itch. I was forced to sit still for hours on end, the heat of the day beginning to marinate through the car's interior and wring all the moisture out of my body. Claws that wrapped around my neck and left its chafing marks along my boiled skin. This feeling of being suffocated by the dry air was only furthered by the sense of being watched. Turning my head back around and peering into the windows of other cars trapped alongside me, it was the worst feeling in the world, to think that any one of these vehicles could be owned by Julia. But among the cars that crawled past, there was one that had particularly caught my eye, a cherry red Ford Mustang with deep black tinted windows, sitting firmly in its place, 2 cars behind my own in an adjacent lane. I knew that Julia had a car like that, one that had been a gift from her father, or so I'd been told. I'd never met her family. She told me that they had passed away when she was younger and had practically been forced to raise herself. It was certainly something I could believe. Sitting there, in that smoking hot matchbox of a car, I had drifted into the past once more, reminiscing what Julia had been like when I first met her. She had been in college while I had gone into a trade, working at a small local diner that reeked of butter, fried bread, and oil, bathed in a perpetual glow of golden sunlight that streamed along the checkered tiles, always at the same time and always casting the woman of my dreams in a halo of warmth. Smiling down at me wearing her loose blouse and tight leather jean shorts, her hair was done up so that it was out of her face, giving me a full view of her cloudy, hazel almond eyes that steamed with desire and vivacity. From those first brief exchanges, there had always been a crackle of energy, one that always traveled with us to the bedroom. The crack of leather and contorting of limbs, silky bindings that had enraptured my hands and legs. She was someone who I could trust to take control, to put my own safety into the hands of someone else and to know what they are going to do was something I found so appealing. Yet now that appeal and the sweet flavors that had washed through my body in those brief moments of vulnerability had become tainted, slowly at first with more exposure, stranger desires, and the elaborate displays that we had grown to share. Then finally the break-in. I couldn't keep lingering on that nightmarish space that had become my home. Instead, turning my eyes forward, still painfully aware of the cherry-colored car, incapable of discerning it as a pursuer. By the time I had reached a cheap motel on the edge of the city, I was more than worn out. My body had been wrung out of all its energy and motivation to continue my journey upstate. An arduous trek that I had only begun to grapple with and was beginning to realize that I was likely unprepared for. Not for any particular reason, more a homesick feeling that was beginning to lodge in my gray matter. Strange now that memories of home were filtered through that omnipresent visage of my ex's voice. "Morning, Meal. How are you, Meal? Are you feeling good today, Meal?" Disgustingly sweet words that slid down my sticky, sweat-stained skin. "Stop it, stop it." I kept chanting to myself within my headspace, trying to halt my dazed repetition of things I used to hold dear as I collected my keys and meandered to my room, stumbling through the door and falling across the bed with my arms out and face buried between the sheets. Breathing heavily into them and letting my warm breath cloak my face, I let my body warm into a comfortable state of paralysis. I didn't move for a long time after that, tired out by the day, as the sun had started to eclipse the concrete and glass monoliths of home. It was a moment where I wished for nothing more than to sink into the furniture I lay upon and cease to feel any of these thoughts that had plagued my journey. The lust, the desire, the fantasies and the horrors. I wanted none of it. I mean it. It took a great deal of effort to pry myself off those sweat-stained sheets so that I could wash up and change before bed. I could keep driving tomorrow and just take the time that I needed. It was a pleasant thought, one that soothed my aching back as I lay down to sleep. The sickly yellow tint that touched the popcorn-textured walls, waning shades as the ceiling light flickered, the still corners of the room almost bending up around me and tightening into a bundle that held me. Place. Yet even within that cradle of quiet, there was only one thing that shifted in the muddled light. The corner of the blinds that cloaked the dark pool that submerged my room, pushing up against the door with a tightness that threatened at any point to fracture the glass and wash into my room. But I was safe with that sheet of thin cloth, holding my worries at bay, fluttering in a hypnotic loop that lulled me into a peaceful, resting sleep. My eyes snapped open through foggy lids, and I felt myself spasm with discomfort. I had no clue how long I had been asleep for. The room was dark, and I needed to wait several minutes, laying on my back and waiting for the shapes to come into focus, being aided only through the bathroom light that carved its way along the ground in a thin line. I continued to stay perfectly still, my chest rising and falling with my breath, before I felt my mind recoil at a crackling hiss and the television at the foot of my bed sparked to life. Oddly enough, I found myself unable to lift my neck and instead watched the program at the bottom of my eyes. It was a nature documentary, one from the late 80s, judging by the film grain, color grading, and voiceover that chirped to life. A strangely restrained murmur that coughed out every word, talking over the image of two birds with their long winding necks intertwined, a pair of courting swans. And here we have the Cygnus swan, uncommon among birds. Swans are known to mate for life, forming an inseparable bond that carries into death, with swans even grieving the partners they lose. It kept going, a drawling weight in his lungs that made me feel distinctly uncomfortable, watching that old TV program in the dead of night. But when I tried to move my arms, I could barely muster the strength, instead only shifting my fingers that were flooded with a dull weight and a peculiar pressure at my wrists. I was trapped, stuck with all the power of a fly in a glue trap. Panic was something that came naturally. But instead of a shot that would have given me a boost to throw myself from the bed and silence that infernal blaring noise that continued to repeat on screen, I was offered a measly cough and lurch before returning to my place on the bed. Groggy, weak, and dazed. "Have you slept well?" The gentle chorus of her words glazed my near-naked body with a tenderness that disturbed me. I would have screamed if the energy was given to me, but I could still see her, a black silhouette that stood in the frame of the bathroom, detail all but abandoned from her outline of negative space, draining what little energy I had left. I couldn't even make out her smile as her lithe figure tiptoed over to me, long hair swaying alongside the near see-through satin nightdress she wore. "I'm sorry, I know you don't like medicine." Just from the infantile way she addressed me, I could tell she was putting on a mock frown. All the while, her burning eyes sliced pieces of my chest away to reveal tender flesh beneath. "I know you'll forgive me." One of her hands traced the bindings on my right wrist, positioning herself as she straddled me, and let her other hand wander across my wrist. It was a very clumsy motion that left only a chance to glance at her face that was still bathed in shadow. Seeing the wetness at the corners of her mouth and the droplets of spit that dripped from her beaming maw onto my naked skin, I wanted to cry. I had never felt so vulnerable before. Being laid out and eyed with all the fervor of a hungry dog was something I was familiar with. But this was different. All this was different. "I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request." Then she started to do things to me, lowering her face to my abs, her spine bending and cracking as her lolling tongue lapped at my flesh, climbing rapidly as it left a trail of cool slime in its wake, claws pawing softly against my stomach as if she was feigning the actions of digging into my abdomen, interchanging the action with her stronghold on my wrists. Before long, her mouth was inches from my own, closing the gap in mere seconds, kissing me with a deep and primal pushing, an action that continued to knock against my already strained mental state, my every nerve being set ablaze with the unbridled passion and need that the kiss demanded. Her tongue painted my face with a thick layer of spit as it slunk inside my mouth and brushed over my teeth, tracing each with a careful desire that drew the action out to a painfully long time. I felt sick to my stomach. The way she had completely immobilized me and was doing as she pleased. I wanted to fight her off and scream, to push her away and run out of the room. But I couldn't do anything as her sharp teeth sunk into my lower lip. Softly at first, then with a sharp tug as she threw her head back and ripped the skin off my lower lip with a sickening tear, washing blood into the back of my throat that mixed with the salt from my silent tears into an unholy broth. She noticed my weeping and gave a twisted, simpering pity smile. "I'm sorry, Meal. Did Mommy hurt you?" Another dose of her poison flooded my guts and my revulsion tripled. I hated how she disabled me and hated even more that I was now at the mercy of every sick fantasy she'd ever had. But more than that, I hated how, if circumstances were different, I probably would have gone along with Julia's games. My thoughts wandered to reminiscing, even in the danger I was currently in. What the hell is wrong with me? Don't worry. Her words roused my stuporous body once again, as her weight shifted and a sting sped through my chest, a needle burrowing into my pecs. We'll have plenty of time together before it's all over. Her form shifted and flickering as my conscious mind vanished and I was falling into a deep slumber, barely aware of the feeling of cloth rubbing against my blood-coated mouth.